Good morning, I'm Chris Baker for syracuse.com. I'm here today with Dana Balter, who's running for Congress in the 24th Congressional District in Central New York. Good morning, Dana.
Hi, thanks for having me, Chris.
Of course. We are going to be doing a live question and answer session this morning with Dana. We're going to take the next hour or so and pose questions from readers for Ms. Balter. We solicited questions several days ago. We've gotten about 20 questions that we'll be asking. Those questions have not been shared in advance. If you have questions you'd like to ask as we go, we're streaming live on syracuse.com as well as on Facebook. Feel free to put your questions in the comments on Facebook or syracuse.com. We're going to do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. If we don't get to your questions, you can send them to us and we'll do our best to get them answered sometime throughout this campaign. The primary election is Tuesday, June 26th. It is a Democratic primary. Dana Balter is running against Juanita Perez-Williams in that race. I think that covers all our preliminary ground here. So if there's nothing else, we'll dive right into some of our pre-submitted questions here.
Okay.
We'll start off. This first question comes from Mark Wise, who is the DCCC precinct captain in Geddes. Mark wants to know, why are you a better candidate than Juanita Perez-Williams? And with that said, why do you think you have a better chance to defeat John Katko in November?
Okay. So I think one of the things that makes me a very good candidate is the way that I have been able to build support across this district. I have been campaigning since last September, traveling all across the 24th to every part of the district, talking to people who live here, listening to what they have to say about the problems that they're facing in their lives and in their communities, the things that they want to see government do to help them address those problems. We've been having great conversations. I have learned a tremendous amount from the voters in the district. And I think having those conversations, making it clear where I stand on the issues, and that my intention in running in this race is to stand up for the people of the 24th District and fight for what's in the best interests of the people here, as opposed to party leadership in Washington or big money donors from corporate America or anywhere else that they come from. I think that is what has enabled me to galvanize the support that this campaign has. And I believe that what we need to be doing in our politics broadly is getting back to the people. All of these things should be coming from the ground up, not the top down. We need to put power back in the hands of the people who live here. That's what my campaign is premised on. That's how I want to represent this district in Washington, D.C., and I think that's what makes me the strongest candidate. I also think that approach, not only to the campaign, but to what being a representative is all about, is what makes me a better option than John Katko, and I think that's what's going to help us defeat him in November. John Katko is my congressman. One of the ways that he has disappointed me the most is by being unwilling to engage with all of us who live here in the district. And whether that comes through in his lack of willingness to hold town hall meetings, or it comes through in his lack of willingness to tell us where he stands on the issues. I can't tell you how many times I've called his office to find out, where does the congressman stand on education policy? Where does the congressman stand on this bill that's coming up for a vote tomorrow? And I never get answers. Nobody that I know ever gets answers. That level of disengagement and refusal to communicate with constituents, I think, is unacceptable. We deserve a representative who is going to engage with us, who is going to be open and honest, who's willing to show up and look us in the eye and have this kind of conversation. And I think, based on what I'm hearing everywhere I go in the district, people are fed up with his approach to this job and are looking for somebody who's going to do it differently, and that's me. So
what will be your plan as far as, you mentioned town hall meetings, and I know that was something that was pushed a lot last year. Mm-hmm. Would you have regular meetings? Would you? What would be your approach to something like that?
So I think, you mean once in office?
Once in office.
Okay, so if I am lucky enough to be able to serve this district in Congress, One of the things that I promise to do is to maintain open, two-way communication between the people who live in this district and me and my office and staff. And there are a lot of components of that. One is regular town hall meetings. And what I am talking about when I say town hall meeting is an open access public meeting where anybody is welcome to attend and participate in conversation, where questions are not pre-screened, where people get to say what's on their mind. I hope that people do that with respect. I think that the way that we make democracy healthy and strong is by engaging in civil discourse, right? Where we talk about difficult issues, we disagree with each other, but we do it with respect. That is a really important part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process. So I mentioned my frustration with trying to get information out of John Katko's office. That's another really important piece of this. There needs to be regular communication from the representative to the people of the district. That means we need to be letting them know where their representative stands on the issues. When I am in office, I will make sure that my staff has information to communicate to people when they call in. Every time I take a vote, shouldn't say every time, there are lots of little procedural votes that nobody is going to care about, but every time I take a substantive vote, I will put out a statement explaining why I voted the way that I did on that issue. Before I cast the vote on important substantive issues, I will have substantive and meaningful ways for people in the district to send their opinions to me so that they can let me know what they think about this issue and how they would like to see me vote. All of that is a really important part of the process of being engaged with the constituency.
All right, speaking of how you would vote, this next question comes from Mark Vineski. He says, if elected, would you vote to impeach Donald Trump?
So I don't know where this process stands right now because there's, this ongoing investigation. Here's what I think we have to do. I think we need to let Robert Mueller complete his investigation. I have a tremendous amount of faith in him. The way he is running this investigation, it has been incredibly productive and speedy. I know it feels like it's taking a really long time, but if we compare this investigation to other investigations in other administrations, it's moving very fast and generating a lot of results. I think what we need to do in Congress is protect that investigation. Make sure that Robert Mueller cannot be fired, which Donald Trump has talked many times about doing, and let the investigation play out. When we have the results of that investigation, which I imagine will not be too much further down the road, we need to do whatever is appropriate to hold people accountable for their actions. We don't yet know what those results are, so I can't say what I think the appropriate measure of accountability is. But I think whatever that investigation generates and whomever is demonstrated to have committed grievous wrongs, they need to be held accountable.
You've been following the investigation, I'm sure. In your opinion, do you think there is something there? Do you think that Donald Trump has acted in some way inappropriately?
Well, there's absolutely a lot there. Even from what we have seen already, there's a lot of evidence that he and his entire campaign were engaged in, at minimum, unethical behavior. But again, we don't know the extent. We don't know the extent of any individual's involvement yet. And so we have to get to the facts, right? We have to have, when we are talking about something like impeaching a president, we are talking about a very, very serious process. And we can't enter into it lightly. And we need to make sure that we understand the scope of the situation and that what we're choosing to do is appropriate.
This is kind of the flip side of that same coin. This comes from Rebecca Herman in Cicero. She wants to know, what is something that you can work on with Trump and with the Republicans if you're elected to Congress?
I think that there are a number of things that are ripe for bipartisan efforts. There are a lot of things that we agree on, and there are a lot of things where we have the same goal. We might just have a different way of getting there, right? And those are the things I think we should focus on. A couple of projects that I think we could make a lot of progress as a unified Congress, really working across the aisle. One is infrastructure. I was hoping that when Donald Trump got into office, that would be his first effort, because I think that is a place where we can have a lot of bipartisan agreement, where we can make progress and sort of rebuild some trust in each other. We have tremendous infrastructure needs in this country. We see it all over central New York. And that is an area of policy where the federal government can step up and do a lot to support state and local efforts. So that's something I'd like to see us working on together. Another thing that is that has a lot of support on from really all parts of the political spectrum and both sides of the aisle is a carbon dividend, which is some people call it a carbon tax. It is a market-based solution to deal with the problem of carbon emissions. And it has a tremendous amount of support from conservative thinkers and conservative policymakers. It also has a lot of support from liberal thinkers and liberal policymakers. So this is an area that is just begging for some bipartisan work, where I think we could make real progress and do something really good for our country.
Okay. One more about politics. This one comes from Eric Brubaker. He wants to know, if you're elected, would you vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House if Democrats were to retake control of the House?
So I don't really know the answer to this question, because when I choose a candidate in any election, I choose the best candidate who's running, and I don't know who would be running for that seat. Here's what I can tell you. I think that we need new leadership in Washington. We need new leadership in our parties. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about trying to return our politics to the people. I think that we are stuck in old ways of doing things, and we need to bring not only new energy, but a new approach. We have to make sure that the way politics is run in Washington reflects the needs and interests of the people at home, not the entrenched interests, the leadership, the mega donors. Those are the powers that are having the greatest influence, and that's backwards. The people need to have the greatest influence. That's why I'm running for Congress. I want to be part of a shift in leadership to return politics to the people.
Is there a Democrat in the House who you hold in high regard, who you think represents that kind of new leadership that we need?
I think there are a lot of phenomenal people in office right now, and there are a lot of people who I think might want to step aside and let some new people come up. But I don't have any particular people that I support at this point in time.
Okay. We'll kind of shift gears here to a little bit more about you and your background and history. These next two questions we received from both Donna DiTullio in Syracuse and Vicky Frylu in Baldwinsville. First one, you stated you founded a non-for-profit organization. Can you tell us more about that non-for-profit, like who benefits, how much you've raised, and if it's still in existence?
Okay. I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Neither am I.
Okay. I've never said I founded a nonprofit. I worked for a nonprofit organization. After college, that was my the first part of my career. I was a teacher and then a director of education at a nonprofit organization that provides supports to adults with cognitive disabilities, helping them live independently in the community. The organization is in Connecticut, which is where I lived before I moved to Syracuse. That's where I grew up. And it is still in existence. It has grown tremendously. They now have additional campuses. I believe they have a campus in Arizona as well. And my younger brother, Jonathan, who I talk a lot about in this campaign because he's a huge part of my impetus for running, for wanting to serve in public office, is a client of this organization. Shortly after I began working there, I talked to my parents about having him receive services there because I thought it was such a phenomenal organization. I was really proud to be a part of it and grateful to have had the opportunity to work and serve there, because it not only Was the work itself tremendous, but it also, my experience in that organization and in that work sort of led me down the next stage of my path. It was the work there that led me to be interested in policy, because what I found was that the people we were serving were all facing these barriers in their lives, and if we wanted to help them and people like them achieve success, we had to address the larger barriers. We had to think about them as societal problems, and that's what led me to study policy. So it was a very important part of my life and sort of transitioned me into another phase.
Okay. What was the name of the nonprofit?
Chapel Haven.
Okay. Walk me through the transition from there to Syracuse. So you're in Connecticut, and what was it specifically policymaking that brought you to Syracuse?
Yeah, it was. It was the Maxwell School, right? So I came here to study. When I was working at the nonprofit organization, decided I wanted to study policy, so I went to grad school and got my master's in Connecticut, and then decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD, and that's why I came here to Syracuse.
Okay. Another question that came from both Donna and Vicky. They wanted to know about an illness that you said you had that kept you out of work for some time. They just want to know, can you explain more about it? And is there a chance that this illness could recur and keep you from work if elected to Congress?
Okay. So shortly after I first moved to Syracuse, when I was about a year into my doctoral program, I believe, I had a head injury that left me with a pretty severe concussion, and that caused a whole host of physical effects that took me a really long time to recover from. So I had to spend many years sort of figuring out how to manage all of those things and what to do to recover from those effects. And thankfully, with a tremendous amount of support, especially from my family, and a lot of hard work, I was able to. And I am now healthy, and I don't foresee any reason why that would present problems or challenges in the future. And I think that what it taught me is how important it is to have a good support system and people that you can rely on to help you through the tough times.
All right. Changing gears again, this one comes from Nora Miles in Syracuse, and you kind of touched on this a moment ago. She wants to know if you will be taking money from PACs, political action committees, and will you take dark money, super PAC money, to spend in the district that supports you? I'm gonna add to her question. So she wants to know if you would take money from PACs during the campaign and during the election. I'd like to take that further and know if you were elected, would you take money from super PAC organizations?
So I have made a pledge not to take corporate PAC money. I will accept PAC money from organizations like Planned Parenthood or League of Conservation Voters who are working to advocate for issues that align with my platform. I will not take corporate PAC money. And when my ultimate objective is to get money out of politics altogether. So again, if I'm lucky enough to be elected and serve in office, my number one priority, what I want to start on in day one in that legislative session is meaningful campaign finance reform. I want to see all PAC money out of elections. I think, again, this goes back to the recurring theme of trying to restore power to the people. I think as long as we have a campaign finance system that allows these large amounts of money to come from organizations and corporations instead of individuals, we are giving our elected officials an incentive to respond to their needs instead of the needs of their constituents. And I think we need to change that fundamentally.
Do you support publicly financed campaigns?
I do.
Elections, rather.
I do. I think that should be our ultimate goal. They should be publicly financed, and we should be spending far less money on a campaign. That will also shorten our election cycles, which I'm sure everybody will be happy about. But as with many of our goals, I think that is the big picture goal, and we have to continue to take small steps as we get there. So there are some bills under consideration in Congress right now that don't get money out of politics altogether, right? They don't move us to public financing, but they do help. So for example, there's a bill under consideration to shine a light on dark money. Right now, unlimited amounts of money can come in, and we as the voters have no right to know where that money is coming from. Under this particular bill, we would know where every penny comes from. So that doesn't get money out of politics, but it increases transparency, and it helps towards that goal of making our elections freer and more fair. So I'll support measures like that along the way as well, but I do think the ultimate goal is public financing.
Realistically, I mean, the odds of getting something through, I feel like we've seen a lot, especially in New York State, but also on the federal level, of people saying, when I get in office, I want campaign finance reform, and then that priority almost always slips somewhere down the list. Realistically, in your first term, if you were elected, what do you think the chances are of getting something meaningful done on campaign finance reform?
I'm hopeful, and I'll tell you why. I recognize that it's an uphill battle, right? Because the lawmakers are the ones who benefit from that money. So getting the lawmakers to turn around and say, no, we're not going to take that money anymore is a challenge. But here's why I'm hopeful. This is one of these issues that our legislators lead us to believe is controversial, but public opinion data shows isn't. More than 80% of people in this country, Republican and Democrat and unaffiliated, want big money out of politics. The people understand that we have to do this, because if we don't, we can't do things like lower the cost of prescription drugs or get off of fossil fuels or pass common sense gun safety measures, right? The big money in politics is one of the major roadblocks to getting all of those things done. And people know that, the voters know that, and that's why they support getting big money out of politics. So I think what we need to do is, the same way the people rose up this year and said, no, you can't take away our health care, we need to see the people rise up and say, if you don't pass campaign finance reform, we will vote you out of office. Because the only thing electeds care about more than the donations is their seat. And if you convince them that they can't keep that seat, they'll listen to you. If we use that power to get money out of politics, then they're going to have to listen to us about everything else too.
Let's change gears again. Just to remind, we're about a little more than 20 minutes in. I'm Chris Baker, sitting down with Dana Balter, who is running for Congress as a Democrat in the 24th District. She is running in a primary race. The election is June 26th, Tuesday. So we're taking questions from readers. If you're just joining us on Facebook or on syracuse.com, feel free to pop a question in the comments. We're going to get to as many as possible. And to that end, I'll shut up and we'll get to some more questions. We got several different questions on specific pieces of policy.
Okay.
The first one comes from Vanessa Link in Liverpool. She says, Dana, we have an incarceration problem in this country. Do you support harsher penalties for drug dealers?
Harsher penalties for drug dealers.
Harsher penalties for drug dealers.
Okay. I do support harsh penalties for drug dealers. I don't know that they necessarily need to be harsher than they are right now. I think part of the mass incarceration problem is not about how we prosecute and punish drug dealers. It's about how we prosecute and punish drug users. And we have extraordinary numbers of people who are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. That, I think, is what we need to change to deal with the mass incarceration problem. We need to get rid of mandatory minimums, and we need to trust that the judges who are in place have the understanding and the professionalism and the capability of making appropriate decisions in the cases that are before them. They need to be able to exercise their discretion to do what's appropriate. And so I don't I think that drug dealers are doing tremendous harm to our communities, and they need to be prosecuted and punished appropriately. My understanding is that that is not what leads to the mass incarceration problem. It's at the other end. It's people largely who are suffering from drug addiction, which is a medical problem, not a criminal problem, and we have to treat it as such.
Sort of piggybacking off that, and because we asked John Katko this, I think last year, do you support legalizing marijuana in any of the several forms that have been proposed?
I do support legalizing marijuana for a number of reasons. One, it is part of the way to address this problem. People who are using marijuana do not belong in our overcrowded mass incarceration system. There's a really important reason to legalize marijuana for the 24th District in particular, and some other places around the country like ours, and that is the opioid crisis, which has ravaged our communities. A huge percentage of people who have opioid use disorder develop that problem after being prescribed opioids. They take them legally under a doctor's supervision and become addicted. Opioids treat pain, right? They are used as a pain management medication, but they have incredibly harmful side effects, and they lead very quickly and very dangerously to addiction. Marijuana can be a very effective pain management strategy that does not have the same outcomes. It does not cause the same problems for people. And if marijuana as a pain management strategy were available to everybody who suffers from chronic pain, which is a huge number of people in this country, we could avoid exposing so many people to opioids in the first place. I think that has to be a critical part of the strategy to combat opioid use disorder, which is having such a detrimental effect on our communities.
All right. We got a related question that just came in from Facebook, and I'm reading this on the fly, so I'm hoping it makes sense. This comes from Paul Davis, who says drug prices are insanely high. Would you control them by revoking government-granted monopolies to drug companies that charge us more in America than they charge people in other wealthy countries? Most other wealthy nations have this consumer protection in place.
So I think there's a couple pieces here. I agree that drug costs are out of control. Pharmaceutical costs are outrageous. It's one of the significant drivers of outrageous healthcare costs in this country. It is a huge burden on families. The notion that people have to make the decision to buy their medicine or buy food for dinner is outrageous. So it's definitely something we have to address. I think in terms of monopolies, this is a broader question. I want to see the federal government become much more intentional, take a much stronger stance on monopolies generally in all industries. This is something I think we have stopped paying enough attention to, and we're not doing a good enough job of enforcing the rules that are already on the books. And monopolies are bad for prices, they're bad for consumers, they're bad for employees, they result in people losing jobs. So we have to address that as a larger issue. Specifically with regard to pharmaceutical companies, one of the things that we can do really quickly to make a huge difference is allow the government to negotiate drug prices. We can't do that in Medicare right now, and that's, I think, ridiculous. The VA does it. They negotiate, and they see a savings of about 40% on drug costs. Those savings should be available to every American. So that's one really quick and easy change we can make to address this problem. And then, of course, getting back to campaign finance reform, if we get the money out of politics, then the corporations won't have as much power to prevent things like negotiating drug prices from happening.
All right. Got a couple more questions on health insurance and medicine, but they're sort of related, and I want to get to a few other topics, so we might come back to those if we have time afterwards. For those of you chiming in with more questions on this. We'll do our best to get to those, but we got a number of other topics I want to cover, including this one from Rachel Kelly in Syracuse. She wants to know how you plan to address the increasing amount of gun violence in our nation's schools. She says, what is your stance on gun control and or gun sense control?
Okay, so this is a huge problem that our communities are facing. I do want to start by making the point that it's not just in schools. The school shootings are incredibly traumatic events. I think that they are traumatic for the entire nation, not just for the people who experience them directly. But that is only one small piece of the gun violence problem that we have in this country. Gun violence is a problem for the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who commit suicide by gun every year. It is a problem for the thousands of people, women in particular, who are killed by intimate partners with guns every year. And it is a problem for particularly children, but people of all ages in their neighborhoods, in our communities. And we have to address it. There are a number of things I think we need to do. The first two are sort of no-brainers as far as I'm concerned. Number one, we have to institute universal background checks. We have to close the purchasing loopholes that exist. No person should be allowed to buy a gun in this country without a background check. And again, this is not a controversial idea. Our elected officials want us to believe it's controversial because they take money from interests who don't want this law passed. But if you ask the American people, it is not controversial. 97% of Americans agree that we need universal background checks. And I have talked to people all across this district of all political stripes, people who, when I ask them, what is your number one issue? They say the Second Amendment. I want my gun rights protected. Those people are telling me that they want to see universal background checks at the national level. This is not controversial. We have to do it. The second thing that we need to do is repeal the Dickey Amendment, which is a piece of legislation that prevents the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, from studying gun violence, which is outrageous because gun violence is a public health crisis and the CDC is there to study these things. We need good research to tell us, besides universal background checks, what else can we do that we know will reduce gun violence? We have to repeal that amendment, and we need Congress, the federal government, to fund studies of gun violence. Those are the first two things I'd start with.
All right. We're going to keep going to get to a few more topics here. This one comes from Jennifer Cadiz. I hope I'm somewhat getting your name right, Jennifer. She wants to know, what pathways do you see to try to mitigate the damage of the most recent Federal Tax Reform Act to New York State taxpayers?
So I support repealing that tax law. I think it is a terrible piece of legislation. I think it takes particular aim at those of us who live here in New York. We as New Yorkers have chosen to invest our public money in really important things that we value, like education and healthcare and roads. And this bill makes us pay extra for that. It punishes us for making that decision. And that's why I find it particularly extraordinary that our congressman voted for it. It also, there are two other things about this bill that I think are especially problematic. We could talk about lots of little provisions, but I don't think that's necessarily the best use of the time. The overarching effect of this bill is that it gives billions and billions and billions of dollars to the segment of our country that already has billions and billions and billions of dollars. And it does that on the backs of you and me and everybody else in this district who works hard and doesn't have lots and lots of money. And I think that is fundamentally the wrong thing to do with tax policy. Our tax policy should be focused on men and women and families who are working hard, who are generating the profit that those millionaires and billionaires enjoy as CEOs and shareholders. And it should be supporting people who are working hard, who are in the middle class, people with disabilities, students, the people who need support. That's who we have to think about when we create our tax policy. The other thing that is absolutely terrible about this bill is what it did to the ACA. The Republicans in Congress failed to repeal the ACA, thank goodness. And our congressman, John Katko, told us he would never vote to repeal that legislation unless there was a good replacement in place. And yet, he turned around and voted for this tax bill, which essentially did that. Wasn't officially a repeal of the ACA, but by repealing the individual mandate, it gutted the ACA. And we've just seen new numbers coming out for New York State of what that move on the part of John Katko and the GOP is going to do to our healthcare premiums in New York State next year. And particularly here in Central New York, we are going to be hit so hard. There is one insurer in Central New York that is predicting premium increases of 36%. The average across the state, I've seen estimates ranging from 12 to 24%. So this is a very serious and immediate effect in people's lives. They are going to feel this in their wallets. Millions of people are going to lose insurance as a result, and that's because of that tax bill.
All right. Just a couple more. This one comes from Dawn Thompson, and Dawn, I'm gonna Fjord Alice Thompson. Dawn says, "Do you support term limits?"
I don't support term limits, and here's why. I think what term limits are about, the intention behind term limits, is making sure that no individual accumulates too much power or gets so comfortable in office that they can't sort of be fired from the job, and they lose the incentive to work on behalf of the people, right? That's what we care about. That's why people talk about term limits. Here's the problem. If you put a term limit in place, if you have an elected representative who's doing a really good job, who's fighting for all the things you want them to fight for, and is representing your interests well, you should be able to rehire that person as many times as you want. And if we have term limits, you can't do that. I think that the way to address the other problem of somebody not responding to our interests is to make sure that our elections are really free and fair. And that we do by campaign finance reform, to make sure that those people who are in office are not responding to their large donors, but are instead responding to you as the voter. Putting an end to gerrymandering, which we know keeps people in office who the majority of people that live in their area don't want in office, but because of the way the districts are drawn, they keep getting reelected. Thankfully, the courts are addressing that. They're striking down gerrymandering schemes all over the country. Hopefully, they'll continue doing that. And the third piece of it is making sure that it is easy for people to vote. And that means doing things like automatic voter registration and making absentee voting easier, and making sure that polling places are open longer and on more days of the week, or that everybody gets time off from work to go vote, so that everybody has a real opportunity to exercise their voice in the voting process. If we do those things, then we make our elections truly free and fair like they're supposed to be, and term limits become unnecessary. So I would rather see us address those other problems and then be able to elect the people that we want to elect as many times as we want to elect them.
All right. I think that covers most of what we got in here, and I feel like that's a pretty good place to wrap up, because speaking of elections, the primary election is Tuesday, June 26th. Dana Balter joined us this morning. She's running as a Democrat in the primary for the 24th Congressional District. Dana, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them to us, and we will do our best to get them to Dana and her campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.